Before we start, if you enjoy the story, please leave a like and check if you're subscribed. The pod's hull shrieked as it tore through Ashfara 9's upper atmosphere, metal groaning against friction that turned the view screen white with superheated plasma. Elias Render braced himself against the pilot's harness, his fingers flying across the control panel even as every system flashed red, the navigation course spitting error codes in rapid succession. The automated landing sequence had failed 30 seconds into atmospheric entry, leaving him with manual override and approximately 90 seconds before the vessel either disintegrated or became a crater. Voice, angle the heat shield's ventral, redirect reserve power to structural integrity. Reserve power depleted, the AI responded, its dry tone incongruous with the violence shaking the cabin. Impact in 72 seconds. Survival probability 18%. Fantastic. Elias yanked the attitude thrusters hard to starboard, forcing the pod into a shallower descent angle as the rust-colored desert materialized below, broken by deep canyons that cut the landscape into jagged sections. He aimed for the widest ravine, praying the walls would slow his velocity through friction rather than pulverize the pod on impact. The vessel skipped once against a sandstone ridge, the collision jerking his head forward hard enough to blur his vision, then plunged into the canyon's shadow. The impact drove the breath from his lungs. The pod screamed across loose scree and shattered rock, carving a trench through the canyon floor before slamming sideways into a boulder formation. Elias's harness cut into his chest and shoulders, his teeth clacking together hard enough to make his jaw ache. Then, silence, broken only by the hiss of escaping coolant and the ticking of overheated metal. He hung suspended for several heartbeats, waiting for his body to catalog injuries. Bruised ribs, possible whiplash, a sharp pain in his left wrist. Nothing arterial, nothing that would kill him in the next hour. He triggered the harness release and dropped awkwardly to what was now the pod's side wall, his boots slipping on the curved surface. The emergency hatch resisted his first attempt to open it, then gave way with a groan of warped metal. Heat hit him like a physical blow. The air tasted of iron and something acrid he couldn't identify, dry enough to make his throat constrict immediately. His environmental suit's climate controls flickered, struggling to compensate, before settling into a low-efficiency mode that would keep him alive but not comfortable. He crawled through the hatch and softly dark fountain. The pod's white hull was split along the starboard seam, components spilling from the breach like mechanical viscera. The main power cell was intact, but its connections severed. The emergency beacon blinked uselessly, its transmitter crushed beneath a section of collapsed plating. Elias felt his chest tighten, not from the impact, but from the sudden weight of understanding. No one was coming. No one even knew he was here. Voice, status report. Silence answered him. He limped back to the hatch and retrieved the portable core unit, a palm-sized cylinder that housed the AI's consciousness. Its indicator light pulsed weakly, amber instead of the steady green that meant full functionality. Voice. Online, the AI said after a pause that stretched too long. Core power at 4%. Recommend minimal usage. Noted. Can you analyze the atmosphere? Oxygen 19%, nitrogen 74%, trace elements within human tolerance, particulate matter elevated, likely biological spores, recommend filtration. Elias pulled his suit's collar sealed tighter and adjusted the respirator settings. Around him, the canyon walls rose perhaps 50 meters, their surfaces striated in bands of rust red and ochre. Scrub vegetation clung to crevices, low-growing and thorned, adapted to whatever moisture this place offered. The sun hung directly overhead, a pale disk in a sky the color of old bruises. He spent the next hour salvaging what he could from the wreckage. A water reclamation unit, damaged but functional, medical supplies, 3 ration packs, which, at his current metabolic rate, meant 6 days if he rationed carefully. A portable scanner that refused to power on. He laid everything out on a flat section of rock and tried to think like the research scientist he was, rather than the panicked animal his hindbrain wanted him to become. Water first. The canyon floor showed signs of seasonal drainage, which meant a water source somewhere upstream. Food second, though the vegetation looked unpromising and he had no way to test toxicity without voice operating at full capacity. Shelter third, because the temperature would drop once the sun set and his suit's heating elements were already compromised. Movement caught his eye. He turned, squinting against the glare, and saw nothing but heat shimmer rising from stone. Then it moved again, a shift in the shadows near the canyon's western wall. Something large, keeping to the darker recesses where the sunlight didn't reach. Voice, thermal scan, insufficient power. Then what good are you? Excellent question. Elias gathered his salvaged equipment, moving faster now, his eyes darting between his hands and the canyon walls. The thing in the shadows hadn't approached, but it hadn't left either. He needed to find defensible ground before sunset, needed to establish a perimeter, needed to stop his hands from shaking. By the time dusk arrived, he had managed to wedge himself into a narrow cleft in the canyon wall, 20 meters from the wrecked pod. It wasn't shelter so much as a position that couldn't be flanked, with rock at his back and limited approach vectors. His suit's internal temperature had dropped to borderline uncomfortable. The desert's heat was bleeding away with the light, replaced by a cold that seeped through insulation and made his bruised ribs ache. The sound came from his left, a low guttural click that resonated off stone. Elias froze, his hand reaching instinctively for a weapon he didn't have. The click repeated, closer now, accompanied by the scrape of claws on rock. He pressed himself deeper into the cleft, his breathing loud inside his helmet. The creature rounded the boulder in front of him, and his hindbrain finally got its wish. Pure animal terror flooded his system, overriding every rational thought. It stood nearly 3 meters tall at the shoulder, its body low-slung and powerfully muscled, supported by 6 limbs that ended in curved talons. Mottled rust and gray hide made it nearly invisible against the canyon stone. The head was all jaw and sensory organs, tracking him with an intelligence that suggested pack tactics and coordinated hunting. Elias bolted. He scrambled over loose scree, his boots sliding on stone still warm from the day's heat. The creature pursued with horrifying efficiency, its 6-limbed gait eating distance in bounds that made his own desperate sprint look pathetic. He heard it gaining, heard the click-click-click of its breathing, felt the displacement of air as it closed within striking range. The spear took it through the shoulder joint, punching through hide and muscle with enough force to deflect its trajectory, and the creature screamed, a sound that made Elias's ears ring even through his helmet's audio dampening, and stumbled sideways into the canyon wall. A second spear followed, then a third, each strike precise and economical, targeting joints and vulnerable tissue. Elias stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving, and turned to see his rescuer. She stood 5 meters away, another spear raised and ready, her body positioned between him and the wounded creature. Green skin, deep emerald marked with darker patterns along her shoulders and arms. Tall, powerfully built, moving with the kind of controlled grace that spoke of training and experience. Black eyes met his, luminous in the gathering darkness, assessing him with the same cold calculation she had applied to the creature. The hunter retreated, dragging its injured limb, disappearing into the canyon shadows with surprising speed. She watched until it was gone, then lowered her spear fractionally, not sheathing it, not relaxing her stance, just acknowledging that the immediate threat had passed. Elias raised his hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of non-aggression. His mouth was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Thank you," he managed in standard, his voice hoarse. "I'm Elias, human, Frontier Research Initiative." She regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gestured once, a sharp motion toward the canyon's eastern wall, and began walking. After 3 steps, she paused and looked back, waiting. Elias followed. The cave system she led him to was defensible in a way his cleft never could have been. Its entrance narrow enough to control, but opening into a larger chamber with multiple exit routes. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, echoing off stone walls. She had made this place her own, evident in the methodical arrangement of supplies, the carefully maintained fire pit, the weapon rack fashioned from salvaged materials and bone. She gestured to a section of floor near the cave's wall, then moved to her weapons, methodically cleaning and inspecting each spear point with focused attention. Elias sat where indicated, acutely aware that he was alive because she had chosen to intervene, that he remained alive because she continued to allow it. He watched her work, unable to look away. The way her hands moved over the weapons, checking balance and edge, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, the occasional flicker of bioluminescence along the striations on her shoulders, faint enough he wondered if he was imagining it. She never looked at him directly, but he knew she was tracking his every movement, aware of him with the same hypervigilance she had demonstrated against the hunter. When she finally settled across the fire pit from him, spear within easy reach, the silence between them felt less like absence of sound and more like a conversation neither of them knew how to begin. Elias opened his mouth to speak, to offer some explanation or gratitude or introduction. She met his eyes then, and the intensity of that gaze killed the words in his throat. Instead, he nodded once, an acknowledgement of the unspoken terms of his survival. She returned the nod, then turned her attention to the cave's entrance, keeping watch while he sat in alien territory, grateful and uncertain, and more aware of another person's presence than he had allowed himself to be in years. 3 days passed before Civer spoke to him in words rather than gestures. Elias had learned her communication system. A pointed finger meant follow, a raised palm meant stop, a sharp slash meant danger. She moved through the canyon system with absolute confidence, and he followed because the alternative was dying alone. On the 4th morning, she knelt beside a depression where moisture collected overnight, scooped water into her cupped hands and drank. Then she looked at him directly. "Safe," she said. Elias dropped beside her and drank, the water cool and mineral. When he surfaced, she was already moving again, but something had shifted between them. She taught him through demonstration how to identify the purple leaf ground cover that stored water in its roots, how to move through scree without announcing his position, how to read canyon shadows. He absorbed it with intensity he once applied to xenobotanical studies, his hands mimicking her movements, his body learning survival's rhythm. When he stumbled on loose rock, she caught his arm. The contact lasted 2 seconds before she released him, but Elias felt the heat of her palm for the next hour. That night, she watched him prepare a ration pack. He held it out in offering. She shook her head, then retrieved something wrapped in leaves from her supply cache. The meat inside was pale and stringy. "You've been here a long time," he said. She nodded. "How long?" 8 cycles. Solar cycles. 8 years. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. 8 years alone, surviving through skill and stubborn will. "I'm a botanist," he said. "Was studying extremophile plant networks when my navigation system died." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to make his pulse quicken. The wound on her shoulder had reopened during their supply run to the geothermal spring. Elias noticed the fresh blood, the way she favored that arm. "Let me look at that," he said. She tensed, hand moving toward her nearest weapon. He kept his own hands visible, waiting. After a long moment, she nodded, then sat by the fire. The wound was infected, angry red spreading from the edges. Elias cleaned his hands methodically, then opened his medical kit. "This is going to sting. Broad spectrum antimicrobial." He pressed the applicator to her skin, and she went absolutely still. Not from pain, he realized, but from the unfamiliarity of being touched. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying bonding agent. Her skin was warmer than human baseline, the striations along her shoulder textured under his fingertips. "Done," he said, pulling back. She tested the range of motion carefully, then met his eyes. "Thank you." The words hung between them, weighted with more than gratitude. Elias nodded and busied himself repacking his supplies while his heart hammered. The ruins appeared on their seventh day together, rising from the canyon floor like broken teeth. Ancient stone carved with symbols Elias didn't recognize, structures collapsed, but still suggesting grandeur. What is this? Civer stood at the ruin's edge. Dead civilization. They left nothing but stone. Elias moved closer, running his hand over the carved symbols, feeling the grooves worn smooth. They were here before Ashfar became uninhabitable. Everything dies. No emotion in her voice, but Elias heard the weight beneath. 8 years watching ruins, waiting for death that refused to come. He turned to find her watching him with intensity that made his breath catch. Not everything, he said. A sandstorm rolled in that afternoon, sky turning rust and blood as wind whipped sand into a blinding wall. Civer grabbed his arm and ran toward intact ruin. They barely made it inside before the storm hit. The space was small. Touching became inevitable as temperature dropped. Elias huddled against the wall, suit heating struggling, and felt Civer shift closer. "Your suit is failing," she said. "It's fine." She made a sound that might have been exasperation, then moved until her side pressed his, sharing warmth. Elias went rigid before forcing himself to relax. Survival first. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, muffling sound until they existed in a pocket universe of stone and warmth. Elias found himself talking. "I had a sister, younger by 3 years. She wanted to be a pilot, see everything." He paused. "Colonial pathogen outbreak on Kepler 442c. My parents were consultants there. By the time I got the message, they'd been dead for 2 weeks." Civer's hand found his arm, grip steady. She didn't speak, just held on, while he breathed through pain. When he finally fell asleep, his head tipped against her shoulder. She didn't move away. He woke to find her steadying him, black eyes luminous in pre-dawn light. The storm had passed. She should have woken him, moved away. Instead, she had stayed. "There's a relay station," she said quietly. "Northeast, 70 kilometers." Elias sat up, missing her warmth. "Does it work?" "I don't know. She paused. "I was ordered not to seek rescue. Not stranded by accident, left deliberately." "We're going to that relay station. You don't understand what I understand that you saved my life, and I'm not leaving you here because someone decided you were disposable." She stared at him, something unreadable behind her eyes, then nodded. They left that morning through terrain that grew hostile. Canyons gave way to tablelands cut by ravines requiring climbing. Elias's hands were raw by the second day, but Civer moved with relentless efficiency, pointing out handholds. On the fourth night, she told him about her exile. Words came slowly while they sat above the ravine. "My unit was ordered to eliminate a human research outpost. Territorial incursion, they called it. 73 personnel, civilians." Elias went still. "I questioned the order, argued that negotiation was protocol for first contact." Her hands curled into fists. "My commander deemed me compromised. When we landed here for reconnaissance, they sabotaged my vessel's reactor and left." "That's not compromise," Elias said, voice rough. "That's conscience." She turned to look at him, eyes bright, with something that might have been tears if very dawny physiology allowed them. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "The hunters came at dawn, coordinated assault while they broke camp." Civer moved immediately, putting herself between him and the larger creature. Her spear found its throat, but the hide was thick, the blow deflecting. Talons rake across her ribs, and Civer went down hard. Elias grabbed sharpened bone and threw himself at the second hunter, unable to watch her bleed without fighting back. The creature batted him aside hard, sending him tumbling across rock. Civer was already rising, one hand pressed to her bleeding side, other gripping spear. She drove it through the first hunter's eye socket, punching through bone. The creature collapsed, twitching. The second circled warily. They stood together, both bleeding, both exhausted, until the hunter decided they weren't worth the cost and retreated. Elias's hands shook as he examined her wound. 3 deep gashes exposing muscle, bleeding steadily. He worked on autopilot, pressure and bonding agent, and bandaging. Stay with me. Just stay here. I'm not going anywhere. But her voice was weaker than it should have been. Elias felt something crack open inside him that he had thought sealed shut. The terror of watching her bleed, the need to keep her alive, the clarity that losing her would be worse than anything he had survived. When the bleeding stopped and her breathing steadied, he sat back, hands covered in her blood, and met her eyes. She reached up and touched his face, fingers gentle despite the violence they had both survived. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The relay station was still 30 kilometers away, but everything had already changed. Civer's injury slowed their progress through the tablelands. Elias insisted on shorter travel days despite her protests, checking the wound twice daily with supplies he couldn't afford to waste. She endured his attention with visible frustration, jaw tight each time he examined the gashes across her ribs. "We're losing time," she said on the 3rd day after the attack. "We're staying alive," Elias countered, pressing fresh bonding agent along the deepest cut. "There's a difference. I've survived worse. Not with me, here to stop you from being stupid about it." Her eyes met his, something sharp and uncertain moving behind them. Then her mouth twitched, almost a smile, before she turned away. The collapsed structure where they sheltered that night had been part of something larger, walls still bearing traces of decorative carving beneath wind-scoured stone. Elias ran his scanner along the markings, surprised when it powered on after days of malfunction. Data scrolled across the screen, fragmentary but coherent enough to piece together meaning. "Civic building," he said, studying the readout. "There's a data cache in the foundation." Civer moved beside him, close enough that her warmth radiated against his side. "Can you access it?" "Maybe, if voice has enough power." He retrieved the AI core, its light barely pulsing. The connection took 3 attempts. Functional. "Barely," voice said. "I need you to interface with this cache. That will deplete my remaining reserves. Do it anyway." Hours passed while voice worked through corrupted data layers. When the AI finally spoke, its voice was noticeably weaker. Ecological collapse records. The civilization called themselves Ashani. They consumed resources faster than regeneration allowed, refused adaptation when climate patterns shifted. By the time they acknowledged crisis, the ecosystem was past recovery. Civer's hand curled into a fist. Elias watched her profile in the scanner's dim light. "They chose extinction rather than change," she said quietly. "Not everyone." The records show dissenting voices who proposed alternatives. They were dismissed as alarmist, unreliable. She flinched, barely perceptible. He set the scanner aside. "Your people will do the same if they don't change. You know that." "My people value strength, discipline, emotional control." Each word came flat, rehearsed. "These kept us alive when our homeworld's resources failed. And now they're killing you, just slower." She turned to look at him, eyes luminous. "I spent 8 years here telling myself my commander was right, that I was compromised, that attachment made me weak. Do you still believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore." Elias reached for her hand, threading fingers through hers. Her skin was warm, no longer alien, just Civra. "Then figure it out. You've got time." She held his gaze for a long moment, then squeezed his hand before releasing it. They reached the relay station 2 days later. The structure rose from the plateau like metal growth, solar panels dust-coated, antenna array twisted but intact. Inside, emergency lighting flickered to life, powered by solar reserves. The communications array's power core sat dead in its housing. Elias ran diagnostics. Core depleted. Replacement parts available. Installation requires 3 days minimum, voice said. 3 days. Elias felt the weight of that timeline. 3 days knowing that when the system powered up, everything would change. We should inventory supplies, Civer said, already moving. They fell into rhythm over the following days. Elias worked on the power core, following Voice's sparse instructions. Civer secured the perimeter, repaired seals, converted a quarter into defensible shelter. They moved with practiced ease, coordination honed by weeks together. On the second night, while Elias calibrated connections, Civer spoke. "What do you want after rescue?" He looked up, surprised. "I used to want to map symbiotic networks across uncharted systems, revolutionize xenobotany." He set down his tools. "Now I just want to not lose anyone else I care about." "That's not a goal. That's fear, maybe. But it's honest." She was quiet, then set aside her spear. "Ask me what I want." "What do you want, Civer?" "I want to be more than what they made me. I want to choose my own path instead of following orders until I'm discarded." She met his eyes. "I want to know if connection is really weakness, or if they were just afraid of being wrong." Elias crossed the space, kneeling before her. Close enough to feel her heat, see the faint luminescence along her striations. "It's not weakness." "How do you know?" "Because I've been afraid of attachment for years, and it just made me half alive. Being here with you, terrified I'm going to lose you when rescue comes, that's the most alive I've felt since I lost my family." Her hand cupped his face. He leaned into the touch, and she made a sound low in her throat that might have been pain or relief. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "My people don't. We're taught that physical intimacy is transactional, functional. Then don't do it their way. Do it yours." She pulled him closer, their foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. Her fingers curled into his suit. "I'm afraid. Me too." She kissed him, tentative, and he responded with equal care. Her mouth was warmer than human, teeth slightly sharper, but the vulnerability beneath was universal. She pulled back, searching his face. "Stay with me tonight. I'm not going anywhere." They moved to the sleeping quarters. What happened there was clumsy at first, both navigating unfamiliar territory with more courage than skill. But they learned, communication shifting from words to touch to breath. Civer's control gradually fractured under patient exploration, her body responding to gentleness in ways she clearly hadn't experienced. Elias, who had kept everyone a distance for years, let himself be completely present. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Civer's head on Elias's chest, his hand tracing patterns. "The relay will be active tomorrow," she said. "I know. They'll come for me." "I know that too." She lifted her head to look at him. "What happens then?" "I don't know, but we figure it out together." She settled back against him, both aware that tomorrow would bring answers neither was ready to face. The relay activated at dawn. The system hummed to life, diagnostic shifting green. Elias initiated broad-spectrum distress signal. The response came in less than 10 minutes. Not from human channels. Veridani. Unit designation, Civra Cath Veridi. Respond for verification. Civer's hand trembled, reaching for the transmit control. Elias moved beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. She glanced at him once, then pressed control. Civer Cath Veridi responding. Location confirmed, Ashwara 9. Requesting extraction. Extraction authorized. Team deploying. Estimated arrival 20 hours. Prepare for debriefing and reassignment. The transmission ended with cold finality. No questions about her survival. No acknowledgement of 8 years abandoned. Just orders. Civra stood frozen, staring at the speaker. Elias watched her shoulders rise and fall, saw her hands curl into fists. "Civra." She turned to him, eyes too bright. "They're coming. I know. I have to decide. Go back or..." She trailed off. "Or stay. Or find something new." "You have options." "Do I?" Her voice cracked. They'll never accept what I've become here. And I'm not sure I can go back to being what I was. Elias pulled her into his arms and she came without resistance. Then don't, he said against her hair. Choose yourself. Choose us. Choose whatever future you want, and I'll be there. She pulled back to look at him, searching his face. You mean that? Every word. She kissed him, fierce and desperate, and he kissed back with equal intensity. The extraction team would arrive in 20 hours. 20 hours to decide between a past that discarded her and a future that terrified her. 20 hours to choose who she would be. Civer withdrew into herself as the hours passed. She moved through the relay station checking equipment, reinforcing seals, her body falling into military efficiency. Elias watched her retreat behind wolves he thought they'd broken down, and the ache in his chest felt worse than any injury. Talk to me, he said when they sat across from each other, neither eating the rations he'd prepared. What is there to say? They're coming. I have to decide. You've already decided. You're just afraid to admit it. Her eyes snapped to his, something fierce and wounded flashing. You don't understand what you're asking me to give up. My people, my culture, everything I was raised to be. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to choose what you want instead of what they told you to want. And if I don't know the difference anymore, Elias leaned forward, closing the distance, then stay with me and figure it out, or come to human space and figure it out. Or find some third option. But don't go back to people who threw you away and expect them to suddenly value what you've become. She stared at him, then pushed back from the table and left. He didn't follow. Some decisions had to be made alone. The Veridani extraction team landed at dawn, their vessel descending with precise military efficiency. Civer stood at the viewpoint watching, posture rigid. Elias stood beside her, close enough to touch, but not touching. I should go meet them, she said. I'm coming with you. Elias, I'm coming with you. She turned to look at him, expression softening fractionally. This won't be useless. Nothing worthwhile ever is. They walked across the plateau toward the landing site. The Veridani ship settled onto rust-colored stone, and 3 figures descended. The lead Veridani was taller than Civer, striations darker, more pronounced. She moved with absolute confidence. Her eyes swept over Civer with cold assessment, then dismissed Elias entirely. Civer Cathveridai, you will accompany us for debrief and reassignment. Commander Toth, Civer said, voice carefully neutral. I request clarification on the parameters of my reassignment. You have no standing to request anything. You were deemed compromised and exiled. That you survived is unaccepted, but it changes nothing regarding your status. Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. They hadn't come to rescue her. They'd come to ensure she remained compliant. So she's supposed to be grateful you didn't finish the job 8 years ago? Talth's gaze shifted to him, contempt palpable. The human is irrelevant to this conversation. The human is standing right here, and the human has spent the last month keeping Civer alive while you left her to rot on a quarantine world. You know nothing of our ways. Civer violated fundamental principles. She questioned an order to massacre civilians. That's not violation, that's conscience. Tal's hand moved to the weapon at her side, a subtle threat. The 2 Veridani behind her shifted position. Elias held his ground, aware he was outmatched but unwilling to back down. Enough, Civer's voice cut through the tension, quiet but carrying absolute authority. She stepped between Elias and Talth, posture straight, no longer the warrior receiving orders, but someone who had found her own ground. Commander, you left me on Ashvara 8 years ago, unreliable. That assessment was correct, perhaps. But in 8 years, I learned something you and the Veridani collective seem incapable of understanding. Rigid systems that cannot adapt will die, just like the Ashani. You dare compare us to extinct primitives. I compare you to people who chose extinction rather than change. And I'm telling you that I choose differently. Talt's expression went cold, dangerous. You are choosing exile then. permanent severance from the collective. No return, no reclamation. I'm choosing a future where vulnerability isn't weakness, where questioning isn't betrayal, where connection matters more than compliance. Civer's hand found Elias's, threading their fingers together. I'm choosing him. The silence stretched. Then Tolth made gesture of dismissal, sharp and final. Then you are no longer Veridani. You are nothing. Wrong, Civer said, satisfaction in her voice. I'm finally something real. Tolth turned and walked back toward the ship, subordinates following. The boarding ramp retracted, and within minutes the vessel lifted off, disappearing into Ashvar's rust-colored sky. Elias watched it go, still holding Civer's hand. Are you okay? He asked quietly. She was silent, then squeezed his hand. Ask me again in a year. Fair enough. They returned to the relay station and reconfigured the distress signal to human frequencies. The response came within hours. A commercial transport 3 days out, willing to provide emergency extraction. Real rescue, not political maneuvering. Those 3 days passed in strange limbo. They fell back into established rhythms, but everything felt different, lighter. Civer smiled more, laughed at Elias's terrible jokes, initiated touch without hesitation. They made love with less desperation and more presence, learning each other without the shadow of separation. On their last night on Ashwara, they climbed to the plateau's highest point and watched the moons rise. Civer sat between Elias's legs, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her. Tell me about your homeworld's oceans, she said. They're vast, blue and green depending on depth and algae concentrations. The water moves constantly, waves that can be gentle or violent. He paused. I haven't been back in 6 years. Will you go back now? Maybe. Would you want to see it? She turned her head to look at him, eyes luminous in moonlight. I want to see everything you love. I want to understand the world that made you. And I want to show you. All of it. Oceans and cities and forests and research stations. Everything. She settled back against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge as darkness deepened. The transport ship arrived on schedule, a battered commercial hauler that had seen better decades. The captain was a gruff woman named Ortiz, who asked no questions about why a human botanist and a Veridani warrior were stranded together on a quarantine world. She just processed their passage fees, showed them to cramped passenger quarters, and left them alone. As the ship broke atmosphere, Elias and Civer stood at the small viewport, watching Ashvara 9 recede below. The rust-colored deserts, the deep canyons, the ruins, all of it shrinking until it became just another world in the vast darkness. Thank you, Civer said quietly. For what? For arguing with Tolth. For making it impossible for me to go back even if I'd wanted to. Elias pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. You would have chosen this anyway. You just needed to know someone would choose you back. She turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands, and kissed him with gratitude and promise in something that felt dangerously close to love. Where do we go from here? She asked when they pulled apart. Forward, Elias said simply. Together. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. She smiled, genuine and unguarded, and he saw in that expression the person she had become, no longer the exiled warrior or the compromised soldier, but someone who had survived isolation and emerged capable of connection. Someone who had chosen vulnerability over control, uncertainty over false security. Someone who had chosen him, just as he had chosen her. The ship's engines hummed steadily as it accelerated toward the transit point, carrying them away from the world that had tried to kill them, and toward a future they would build themselves. Behind them, Ashwara 9 disappeared into darkness, its lessons learned and its purpose served. Ahead, the stars waited, infinite and full of possibility.